Chapter 6 of Barnaby Brocket, The Terrible Thing That Happened at Mrs. Macquarie's Chair. It was almost a week before the journalists and news crews grew tired of sitting outside the Brocket house and went away to bother other people instead. Eleanor hadn't dared to venture outside during all that time, but had brooded indoors, saying little, her resentment towards Barnaby growing all the time. Alistair had taken a few days off work, something he had never done before. As normal people, he announced, didn't call in sick. They worked 5 days a week, 9 to 5, and undertook a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. Finally, on a gloomy Thursday night, they sat in the kitchen together with the door closed. Henry and Melanie were sent to their rooms. Barnaby was left floating on the mattress in the living room. Even Captain W.E. Johns was exiled to the garden, despite the fact that he had conducted his private business earlier in the concealed area behind an apple tree and had nothing further to add. Eleanor began the conversation telling Alistair about an idea that had come to her recently. Actually, it hadn't come to her recently at all. It had come to her in the back of the taxicab 8 years earlier when she was returning from the hospital, and she didn't want to admit that. Alistair thought that her idea had some merit, but suggested a few changes of his own. Eleanor agreed to these changes and added a few more, one of which they agreed to discard as being unnecessary and only there for comic effect. Alistair threw in one final proposal, and Eleanor ran to the kitchen drawer to make sure that her sharpest pair of steel scissors could be found in the usual place. "They're here," she said, holding them up and letting the light from the setting sun that was coming through the window gleam off the blades in a satisfactory manner. And it was then that their terrible decision was reached. "Are we sure about this?" asked Eleanor. "I'm sure if you're sure," said Alistair. "Yes," said Eleanor decisively. "I'm 100% sure. There'll be no turning back, you understand that?" "Alistair, he has no one to blame but himself. Did you put your parents through this nightmare? Did I?" "Should we shake on it?" asked Alistair, extending his hand. "I don't think so," replied Eleanor, unwilling to engage in such a common act. "We're not underworld criminals." The following morning broke with a burst of sunshine and a group of 6 red-eyed common coals making temporary nests in the Brocket garden, much to the displeasure of Captain W.E. Johns, who guarded his patch with an authority not seen since the heyday of the Roman centurions. The family was gathered in the kitchen as usual, finishing breakfast, the children full of beans, the parents unusually subdued. "Barnaby's not wearing his uniform," said Melanie, looking up at the ceiling. "Isn't he going back to school today?" "Not today, dear, no," replied Eleanor. "But all the reporters have left. His brain will grow soggy if he sits around the house much longer." "We'll decide that, young lady," said Alistair. "Not you." "And we have decided," said Eleanor, staring fiercely at her husband, wanting to be absolutely certain that there were no faint hearts this morning. "Haven't we?" "Yes," replied Alistair. "I can confidently say that this is the best decision I've ever made in my life." "That's a little over the top, don't you think?" asked Melanie, looking at her father in surprise. "All you're doing is keeping Barnaby off school for another day." "Everyone in my class thinks Barnaby's brilliant," remarked Henry, reaching across for one more piece of toast, his 7th of the morning, and wondering whether he could fit in an 8th before leaving the table. "They want to know whether I can float too." "You see," said Eleanor triumphantly, pleased that one of her predictions had come true, even if it meant bother for her elder son. "Are they bullying you?" "Of course not," he replied. "I mean, have you seen me?" He had a point. Henry was 15 years old by now and played a lot of sports. It was unlikely that any of his classmates would think of picking on him. Even all that marmalade couldn't break through so much muscle. And anyway, what do I care if they think I float like Barnaby? Doesn't matter what other people think. "It matters an enormous amount," said Alistair, putting his coffee down with an exasperated sigh as he picked up Barnaby's dropped copy of A Tale of Two Cities and handed it back to him. "Why, you wouldn't want people to go around saying that you were a piece of Swiss cheese, would you? Or an ornamental teapot, when it wasn't true?" Melanie sniggered. The idea of her elder brother as a piece of Swiss cheese or an ornamental teapot was one that clearly tickled her. Even Captain W.E. Johns barked in delight, rolling over on his back and kicking his legs in the air triumphantly. "They can say what they like about me," said Henry, ignoring them both. "Sticks and stones and all that garbage." "Are you actually telling me," began Alistair, leaning forward and staring at his elder son as if he barely knew him. "Are you actually telling me that having all your friends know this terrible thing about your brother is not a source of embarrassment to you?" Henry thought about it for a moment. "Yeah," he said, nodding his head. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. Even though most of them probably think that you're just a repressed floating boy yourself." "Maybe I am," said Henry with a shrug. "I've never felt any great urge to float, but who knows if the mood took me, under the right circumstances." "Henry, are you deliberately trying to upset me?" asked Eleanor, putting her coffee cup down in exhaustion. "I'm only telling the truth," said Henry. "It doesn't matter to me that